Right, so we're now going to have a brief look again at the history of Israel. So last week we looked at the early part of the history of Israel up until King David, and this time we're going to have a look at the next bit of history. And the books that we're primarily focused on in this section are the books of Kings and Chronicles, which cover this next section of history, which is primarily to do with the kings of Israel. So the time that they were, well, the children of Israel were living in the land of Israel, and the kings which they had, and the events which occurred. So the books of Kings and Chronicles are the two books, or the four books, which cover this period of time. Kings is a parallel record to Chronicles, and we find that generally both Kings and Chronicles are generally chronological, although they don't quite follow a strict chronological order. Sometimes, because we're dealing with a lot of different kings, sometimes they deal with the life of a specific king first, and then go back to other events which may have happened in their life. But in these two books, we see there's a number of kings which rule over Israel, and we'll have a look at these in a bit more detail shortly, and we'll explain why there's two lines of Israel and also Judah in a short while. But firstly, this period of time, as you can see from the board, covers around 400 years. These two books from the year 1000 BC, with King David and King Solomon, down to around 600, 500 BC, when Israel was taken into captivity, and therefore there were other kings in the land. The first one we'll have a look at. The first king we want to give a bit of information about is King Solomon, who is up here. So last time we looked at King David, who ruled over Israel, and we saw the promises which God made to him, which were fulfilled in the Lord Jesus Christ, as John also touched on earlier. And his son was Solomon, and Solomon then continued to rule over, took over the rule of Israel from his father David. And we just have a look at a few passages for his life. We can come to 1 Kings chapter 3, which is on page 350. So, as we touched on last week, King David was made king of Israel by God. He was picked by God and made king. And then Solomon took over the rule. And in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 3, we read, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and burnt incense in high places. So basically that verse tells us that Solomon continued to follow God as David, his father, had done. He tried to follow God in his life as he ruled Israel. And as Solomon ruled over Israel, God appeared to Solomon in a dream and gave him the opportunity to ask for a blessing in his life. And Solomon asked for wisdom, and it might be something that you may be aware of, the wisdom of Solomon. Solomon was a very wise king. At the time, he was the wisest man on earth, and he had the wisdom from God. And because of that, he was able to judge the people of Israel righteously and justly. And in addition to this wisdom, God also gave Solomon great riches and glory, and the kingdom of Israel flourished under the rule of Solomon, and became very rich and very prosperous. If you just come forward a few chapters to 1 Kings chapter 10, which is on page 360, just to emphasise this point. So 1 Kings chapter 10, the Queen of Sheba in verse 1 has heard of the great wisdom which Solomon had, and the great riches and the glory of the kingdom of Israel. So this was something which had spread. And then in verse 4, just to emphasise the wisdom and the glory of Solomon and his kingdom, in verse 4 we read, "And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all Solomon's wisdom, and the house that he had built, and the meat of his table, and the sitting of his servants, and the attendance of his ministers, and their apparel, and his cupbearers, and his ascent by which he went up unto the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. And she said to the king, It was a true report that I heard in mine own land of thy acts and of thy wisdom." And then if you look at the end of verse 7, she says, "Behold, the half was not told me, thy wisdom and prosperity exceedeth the fame which I heard." So the wisdom and the riches and the glory that she saw when she came to visit Solomon far exceeded anything that she had been told about it. And this reign of Solomon, which we won't look at now, but we can see types into the reign of the Lord Jesus Christ in the future. And of course, those we've mentioned types and echoes before, but we see one of these here where there's a final fulfillment, there's a prophecy into the time of the Lord Jesus Christ. So that's how Solomon started his reign. But we then find that as he progressed, as he continued his life, that he then was corrupted by the power which he had. At this time, he obviously had absolute power over the kingdom and had all these riches and glory, and he then fell away from God. He no longer followed God. And if we look in chapter 11 of 1st of Kings, and verse 4, we read, "For it came to pass, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father." So we saw before that his heart was perfect initially. Before God, he tried to follow God in his life. But we see here that he has changed, and he was no longer following God as he had before. And as a result of not following God, in verse 11, God punishes Solomon. So 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 11, verse 11 to 13, we see there that God punishes Solomon. We'll just read the verses. "Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, For as much as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. Notwithstanding in thy days I will not do it for David thy father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. Howbeit I will not rend away all the kingdom, but will give one tribe to thy son for David my servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake which I have chosen." So Solomon here is punished, and he's told that the kingdom will be taken away from him. And we saw last time that David was given the kingdom by God because he tried to follow God. And so this is the reverse which is happening. But not all the kingdom will be taken away from Solomon. It says in those verses that a tribe would be left with Solomon. And so after the death of Solomon, Solomon's son Rehoboam decided to raise the taxes within Israel, which caused an uprising. The people of Israel didn't like the taxes being increased, and so that they rose up against Rehoboam. And God had said that he would do this. That he, if we had to look further on in the chapter 11, God said that he would raise up people against Solomon to take the kingdom away from him. And one of these key individuals of this uprising was Jeroboam, who then rules over the nation of Israel. And because of this uprising, the nation of Israel, as we see it here at the time of Solomon, which was all the way from Dan up here down to Simeon, Judah in the south, it was split. Some stayed with Solomon's son Rehoboam, but others followed Jeroboam because of the things which Solomon had done. And so the kingdom was split into two sections. The southern section was Judah and Benjamin and Simeon. So that was the southern kingdom, which was known as Judah. And because of the predominant tribe at the time was Judah. And the other section of the nation of Israel was the northern section, which is all these tribes here. And that was known as Israel or Ephraim. And so from this time on, there was then the two nations in what we now know as the land of Israel. And that's why we have these two lines of kings. And so the one line, the nation of Judah, followed the line of King David. So Rehoboam, we said, was Solomon's son. His son was Abijah, and as we go down the line of the nation of Judah, it's the same genealogy, the same family ruling over the nation of Judah. And within that nation there were a number of good kings who tried to follow God in their life, those who worshipped God, and there were those who did not as well. And then in the tribe of Israel, in the northern part, the northern section, we see there was another line of kings, starting off with Jeroboam, as we mentioned. However, these were not all of the same family. In the northern kingdom, there were many uprisings. Many people killed a king to take power. And majority of these kings, well, all of those kings on this side under Israel, they didn't follow God, and they didn't worship God, but instead they went after, they worshipped other gods rather than the God which David and Abraham had served. And so as we go through these kings, the nation of Israel gradually, consistently turned away from God. And as we've just seen in 1st of Kings, because Solomon had turned away from God, the nation was taken from him. And so eventually, in 722 BC, the nation of Israel was captured, or was attacked by the Assyrians, and they were taken into captivity, and the nation was destroyed. But within the same time period that we're considering, whilst there were kings which the books of Kings and Chronicles primarily deals with, you will see over here that there were also a number of prophets at the same time. And we saw last week the role of prophecy, how the prophecy was there to foretell those things that were going to come to pass. Showing those things which were going to happen, and telling the people God's punishments on them if they did not follow God. And so as we go through the duration of the nation of Israel in their land, there were many different prophets which God sent to teach the people, to teach them how they should be worshipping Him, and also to tell them about the destruction which or the prophecies which would happen in their lifetime and beyond. And we'll have a look next week at what these prophets prophesied about, and what their role at this time was in more detail. And then in a couple of weeks' time as well, we then continue with the history, looking more predominantly at the line of Judah in a bit more detail, with the key kings in this line, those who try to follow God. So next week we'll predominantly be looking at Hezekiah, and then the history after Israel had been destroyed, down to when Judah was also destroyed. And I've got this slide earlier. So when we said the kingdom was split into two earlier, I said the southern kingdom was Judah and Benjamin, so that was the two tribes at the bottom. And then the northern kingdom, which Israel or Judah, was the remaining tribes at the top of that map. So that's a very brief detail of the history of Israel from King David to the destruction of Israel. And I'll say next time we'll have a look at the last bit of the section of the Kings and the Chronicles.
So we're going to have a look at a few what we call fundamental principles